Everyone thought this case was over. Paulus closed the file. Officials reassured the public. The town moved on, and for a long time, no one questioned it. Welcome to Dark Town Archives, where we uncover the stories that only seem finished until time proves they never were. This case didn't begin with panic. It began with confidence. Confidence that nothing serious had happened. Confidence that the explanation made sense. Confidence that there was no reason to look any further. That confidence was shared by everyone. The town believed the ending it was given, not because it was deeply examined, but because it felt reasonable, and reasonable endings are easy to accept, especially in places where people trust each other, and danger feels distant. At first, the case didn't even feel like a case. It felt like an event that had already been explained. There were statements, there were timelines, there was reassurance, and reassurance is powerful. It convinces people that curiosity is unnecessary. So curiosity faded. Life returned to normal. Streets stayed quiet. Routines resumed. The case slipped into the background, remembered briefly, and then forgotten. To most people, it was settled history. But something about that ending never fully held together. Not enough to cause alarm. Not enough to demand attention, just enough to feel unfinished. At Dark Town Archives, we've learned that the most dangerous cases aren't the ones surrounded by chaos. They're the ones surrounded by calm, because calm makes people stop asking questions. And this case was calm from the very beginning. The explanation sounded complete. It addressed the surface details. It filled the obvious gaps, and it left no room for doubt, at least, not publicly. Anyone who felt uncertain kept it to themselves. Doubt didn't disappear. It just went quiet. Years passed new. People moved into town, learning the story as a brief summary. Older residents stopped thinking about it altogether. The case existed only as a closed chapter, something that had an ending, even if few people remembered what it was. Until one moment changed everything. It didn't come from the outside. It didn't arrive with media pressure or public outrage. It came from inside the system, quietly, unexpectedly, and without warning. Someone looked again, not to challenge the conclusion, not to accuse anyone, just to review it. And that's when the story began to unravel, because when the case was examined without expectation, without the need for reassurance, something became clear. The ending everyone accepted was built on assumption, on confidence, on the belief that the first explanation was good enough. But good enough isn't the same as correct. One detail stood out immediately, a detail that had always been there. Documented early, mentioned briefly, then dismissed because it didn't fit the ending everyone expected. At the time, ignoring it felt harmless. Now, it felt impossible to ignore. That detail raised a question no one had asked before. And once that question existed, it demanded others. Questions about timelines, about decisions, about why the case moved so quickly toward closure, and most importantly, about why no one ever stopped to ask if the ending made sense beyond the surface. This wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was worse. It was subtle. It suggested that the case didn't end because it was solved. It ended because people wanted it to, and that realization changed how the entire story was seen. The case wasn't reopened officially, not yet, but mentally, it was wide open. The certainty was gone, the comfort disappeared, and in its place was something far more unsettling: doubt. Because if this ending was wrong, what else had been missed? And if everyone believed the case was over, why were the most important questions never asked? The ending didn't arrive suddenly. It was built carefully, step by step, until it felt unavoidable. By the time it was presented to the town, most people didn't see it as a conclusion. They saw it as confirmation. Confirmation of what they already believed. Officials spoke in measured tones. There was no urgency in their voices, no hesitation in their words. The explanation was simple, direct, and reassuring. It answered the obvious questions and avoided the uncomfortable ones. And because it came from familiar authority, it felt reliable. At Dark Town Archives, we've seen how trust can become the strongest piece of evidence, even when it shouldn't. The ending relied heavily on that trust. Details were shared selectively, Timelines were summarized, not examined. Events were grouped together in ways that made them feel complete. Nothing about the explanation sounded suspicious. That was the point. It didn't challenge the town's sense of normalcy. It didn't suggest deeper risk. It didn't demand further investigation. And because of that, it was accepted. The town wanted closure, not complexity, and this ending offered exactly that. It allowed people to believe that nothing truly dangerous had happened, that no one needed to feel uneasy, that life could continue without disruption. So life did. At first, the case was discussed frequently. People repeated the explanation to one another, slowly memorizing it. Over time, the repetition made it feel stronger, familiar, permanent. The ending stopped being questioned because it stopped being examined. And once an ending becomes familiar, it becomes protected. Any detail that didn't fit was treated as irrelevant. Any question that complicated the narrative was quietly discouraged, not through force, but through discomfort. Asking too much felt unnecessary, even inappropriate, because the case was over. At Darktown Archives, we often note that the most convincing endings are the ones that leave the fewest visible gaps. This one did exactly that. It filled the space where doubt could have lived. But filling space doesn't mean filling truth. As weeks passed, attention shifted elsewhere. New events replaced old conversations. The case slipped into the background, no longer urgent, no longer current. It became part of the town's history rather than its present. And history has a way of simplifying things. Complex moments were reduced to summaries. Unclear decisions were forgotten entirely. The ending became a single sentence instead of a series of questions, and with each passing year, fewer people remembered how the conclusion had been reached. They only remembered that it had been. New residents accepted the story without context. Younger generations learned it as fact. The case was no longer something to investigate. It was something to reference. But beneath that acceptance, the ending was quietly aging. As investigative standards evolved elsewhere, the methods used in this case began to feel outdated. What once seemed thorough now felt rushed. What once felt decisive now felt incomplete. Still, no one challenged it. Because challenging an ending means reopening uncertainty. And uncertainty threatens stability. Especially in a town that values calm over confrontation. At Darktown Archives, we've seen this pattern again and again. When an ending protects peace, it becomes untouchable, not because it's proven, but because it's useful. That's why this ending lasted as long as it did. Until it didn't. Years later, when the case was quietly reviewed, the ending didn't collapse immediately. It weakened slowly, subtly, through questions that couldn't be ignored. Questions like, why certain steps were skipped, why some details were never followed up, and why one particular detail had been dismissed without explanation. That detail didn't scream guilt. It didn't prove wrongdoing. It simply didn't belong. And once that realization took hold, the ending everyone trusted began to feel less like a conclusion and more like an assumption. The detail didn't stand out at first. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't change the story instantly. In fact, it had been part of the case from the very beginning, written down, acknowledged, and then quietly pushed aside. That was the problem. When the case was reviewed years later, this detail refused to blend in the way it once had. It sat there, unchanged, surrounded by conclusions that now felt too confident, too clean. At Darktown Archives, we've learned that overlooked details don't disappear. They wait. And when they resurface, they rarely do so alone. This one raised a simple question. Why was it ignored? The answer wasn't corruption. It wasn't a cover-up. It was something far more common. Expectation. Investigators believed they already understood how the case ended, so they didn't feel the need to explore information that complicated that ending. At the time, it felt reasonable. Now, it felt reckless. As the review continued, that single detail began pulling on other parts of the case. Timelines that once seemed solid started to stretch. Statements that had been accepted without challenge suddenly felt incomplete. Decisions that were never questioned now demanded explanation. None of this proved the ending was wrong, But it proved something else. The ending had been reached too quickly. At Darktown Archives, we often say that cases don't break open with new evidence. They break open when old evidence is finally examined without bias. That's exactly what happened here. The detail didn't contradict the official outcome directly. It did something worse. It exposed how fragile that outcome really was, how much it relied on assumption rather than verification. As the implications became clearer, discomfort set in. If this detail mattered, what else had been dismissed? If it didn't matter, why was it recorded at all? There was no easy answer. Those involved in the review didn't rush to make conclusions. They slowed down. They rechecked records, compared notes, looked for explanations that had never been required before. And the more they looked, the more the case shifted. What once felt closed now felt unresolved. What once felt obvious now felt questionable. The case wasn't just being reconsidered, it was being redefined. News of the review didn't spread loudly, it moved quietly, through conversations and private discussions. But even without public announcements, people began to sense that something had changed. The certainty was gone. At Darktown Archives, we've seen how communities react at this stage, not with panic, but with hesitation. When an ending you've trusted for years begins to weaken, the first response isn't anger. It's disbelief. People ask themselves how they could have accepted the ending so easily, how they could have stopped asking questions, how something so small could matter so much. And that's when the most unsettling realization emerged. The case didn't end because it was solved. It ended because everyone expected it to. Expectation had shaped belief. Belief had shaped silence, and silence had protected the ending, until now. This wasn't a moment of revelation. It was a slow unraveling, a quiet understanding that the case may have been closed for the wrong reasons. And once that understanding took hold, it couldn't be undone. The detail that shouldn't have been there had done its job. It forced the case back into uncertainty. It demanded a second look, not just at the evidence, but at the decisions that shaped the outcome. Once doubt entered the case, it didn't stay contained inside files and records. It moved outward, slowly, carefully, until it reached the town itself. And when it did, the reaction wasn't explosive. It was restrained. People didn't argue openly. They didn't demand answers in public. Instead, conversations changed tone. Sentences ended early. Questions were asked quietly, if they were asked at all. The ending everyone trusted was no longer solid. At Darktown Archives, we've seen this moment many times. It's the stage where certainty fades, but nothing has replaced it yet. And that space, between belief and truth, is deeply uncomfortable. Some residents felt relief. For years, they had carried a sense that something didn't quite fit. They never had proof, never had the confidence to speak openly. But now, that doubt felt justified. Others felt defensive, not because they were hiding anything, but because admitting the ending might be wrong felt like admitting they had been wrong to trust it. In a small town, trust is personal. Questioning the outcome felt like questioning judgment, loyalty, even identity. Local officials responded cautiously. There were no dramatic statements, no confirmations, no denials. Everything moved slowly, deliberately. Public reassurance still existed, but it sounded different now. Careful, measured, less certain. People noticed. The case started appearing in unexpected places. A quiet remark at a store. A pause during a conversation, a question that was asked and then quickly withdrawn. The town didn't panic. But it didn't relax either. The outcome nobody expected was taking shape at Darktown Archives. We often note that communities don't fear truth. They fear instability, and this case threatened stability in a way no one anticipated. It didn't suggest danger, it suggested uncertainty, and uncertainty lingers. Residents began revisiting their own memories, where they were when the case first happened, what they were told, what they believed without question. And slowly, many realized how little they actually knew. They had accepted the ending because it was presented confidently. They trusted it because everyone else did, not because it was deeply examined. That realization was heavy. The town had built years of normal life on an assumption, and now that assumption was weakening. Familiar places felt different. Streets felt quieter. Conversations felt cautious. The case wasn't just history anymore. It was present again. There was pressure to decide what to do next. Some wanted the case officially reopened. Others wanted it left alone. Not because they didn't care, but because reopening it meant acknowledging that closure might never come, and that possibility frightened people more than the original event ever did. At Darktown Archives, we've learned that endings don't collapse all at once. They erode piece by piece, and by the time people realize it's happening, there's no way to restore what was lost. That's where this town found itself. The ending everyone thought was final no longer held authority, but the truth hadn't fully emerged either. The case was suspended between what people believed and what they now questioned. And that suspension changed everything. Because once doubt becomes part of a story, it can't be removed. It reshapes how the past is understood and how the future is approached. The town was no longer asking, "What happened?" It was asking something far more unsettling. Why were we so certain? In the end, the case didn't conclude with a revelation. There was no single discovery that replaced the ending everyone once trusted. No announcement that finally made everything make sense. What arrived instead was something far more difficult to accept. An outcome without certainty. The review confirmed what many had quietly suspected. The original ending was reached too quickly. Not because of malice, not because of deception, but because confidence replaced caution. Assumptions replaced verification, and comfort replaced curiosity. Nobody expected that to be the final result. At Darktown Archives, we've learned that some cases don't change because new facts appear. They change because old beliefs fall apart. This was one of those cases. When the certainty collapsed, nothing clean was left behind to replace it. The town had to face a reality it never prepared for. The ending it trusted for years could no longer be defended. But the truth, shaped by time and lost opportunities, could no longer be fully recovered either. Evidence had faded, memories had blurred. The moment for clear resolution had passed. What remained was accountability. Accountability for how easily reassurance was accepted. Accountability for how quickly questions were silenced. Accountability for how normal life continued without demanding clarity. That accountability changed the town more than any verdict ever could. People didn't become fearful. They became cautious. Conversations shifted. Explanations were no longer accepted at face value. The community learned, slowly and painfully, that certainty is not the same as truth, and that closure can sometimes be an illusion. This was the outcome nobody expected. Not justice in the traditional sense. Not answers that closed every door. But awareness. The case became a lesson rather than a conclusion. A reminder that investigations don't end when files are closed. They end when questions are truly answered. And when questions are left unasked, their absence lingers far longer than any headline. At Darktown Archives, this is why stories like this matter. Not because they shock, but because they reveal how easily people and systems can mistake confidence for correctness. The town didn't lose its identity because of this case. It refined it. Normalcy was no longer defined by silence, but by responsibility, by the willingness to question endings that feel too easy. And while some questions will never be answered, the lesson remains. The most dangerous outcomes aren't the ones we fear. They're the ones we accept without looking closer. This case didn't end the way anyone expected, but it changed how the town understood truth, trust, and accountability. And in that sense, it never really ended at all. If this story made you reconsider how easily endings are accepted, consider subscribing to Darktown Archives for more educational research-based crime documentaries that focus on understanding, not sensationalism. If you believe these stories deserve careful attention, like this video, and share it with others who value awareness over assumption. Because sometimes, the real outcome isn't an answer. It's the realization that we should have asked better questions from the start.